I'm really excited to introduce to you Dr. Bill Arnold, who is a professor of Old Testament at Asbury Theological Seminary. I'm tempted to ask how many have been in your class, but he says don't do that. That's good. We've got some. I'll have to raise my hand. Here's the thing. You don't always get to be friends with your professors after seminary. I am deeply, deeply, deeply grateful that Bill Arnold has become a friend, a colleague. We've been able to work on things like this and other things in the year since I finished Asbury, and I'm grateful for that. Theological education is the topic. You are no stranger to that, and so we're excited to hear from you. Thank you, Matt. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Now it's green. Okay. So when Matt first asked me to participate in this conference, he asked me to write on the topic Reconstructing Theological Education. He further developed it in a series of questions. What is at stake in the education of clergy? What are the implications of not requiring at least some clergy to obtain a graduate degree? What is the theological framework for this discussion? How do churches and seminaries develop a relationship of trust going forward? What is the end purpose or goal of theological education? In the meantime, he has written a compelling article entitled On Not Overcorrecting: Bishops, Baptism, and Seminaries in the Global Methodist Church. In that article, Matt made the point that our fledgling denomination is in danger of overcompensating regarding the relationship to the seminary and theological education. The view that most mainline seminaries served us poorly the past few decades has created a climate in which some GM leaders are suspicious of theological education in general. The sentiment is, as Matt put it, we did faithful work despite the seminaries. So why do we even need them now in the GMC? Now, he wanted me to make clear that that's not his position. He's simply pointing out that some are there today. He goes on to say, but this question is aimed in the wrong direction. It represents an overcorrection. The solution isn't to dispense with an educated clergy. The solution is to do quality control and ensure that the education the clergy receive is faithful and rigorous. These are great points. And in many ways, Matt is more qualified than I am to make this presentation. Being a pastor theologian with a terminal degree in a classical discipline, serving in the space between the church and the academy, that is actually a very unique position in which to stand and to serve. And I think we should listen to Matt. And I want to thank him for this organization and for organizing this, and for this local congregation, Christ Church, for hosting us. And now I'm going to insert something I've not planned to say, at the risk of taking away some of my precious minutes. I was first elected to General Conference as a delegate in 2008, and I've attended every General Conference since, and attended literally countless meetings. And I've always longed for this discussion. And this morning, as Jason began, and it's continued all day for me, including Madeline's Speak on the Holy Spirit, I have almost wept at how this has arrived. I've wanted this day to to drill down to the theological foundations of who we are. So I want this local congregation to know how important this is. This is a hugely important conversation, and so we're grateful that we're here. Now, in some ways, what I am proposing in this paper hopes to point us in the right direction, which Matt's referring to the questions being going in the wrong direction, being careful not to overcorrect, but to offer ways in which the GMC can focus on quality control in training our future pastors and leaders. Matt made a compelling case that I should be the one to speak here after serving on the University Senate for 11 years and teaching in 3 seminaries over several decades. And I responded that actually those are the very experiences that may make me too cynical to speak on this topic. And maybe I shouldn't be the one to be making this presentation. But at the end of the day, I find Dr. O'Reilly impossible to refuse or even to resist at all. here a few observations. First of all, a few observations listed here as they are on the screen for you. The three observations that I'll make: how we got here, what needs reconstructing in this area, which of course suggests something is broken and needs to be rebuilt or renewed in some way. Then I will offer three reflections on theological education for the new church, which I hope will be helpful in some practical way for the General Conference coming up in September. And then finally, a few discussion points in conclusion. And so, first of all, observations, that is being the goal of theological education. Education generally can be thought of as having two varieties. The first type is concerned with acquiring practical or applied knowledge, in which information is collected in order to be used in some way perceived as beneficial to the learner in his or her life's objectives. Books may be read and case studies used as examples, but there's also a sense in which the education is incomplete until the learner is engaged in the doing of the task being studied. To be effective, practical knowledge must be converted into rules of operation or steps of proceeding through action. The second type is concerned with conceptual or theoretical knowledge, which may also have practical applications, but is primarily focused on seeing, understanding, or grasping truth in a way that makes a difference in the learner's life and work. To clarify this distinction, it may be helpful to remember the difference between knowing that and knowing how. Practical disciplines educate one on how to do something that you want or should do. Theoretical disciplines teach you that something is true. We may then simplify this by saying it is the difference between the Bachelor of Science degree, focusing on quantitative skills, the natural sciences, mathematics, technology, and the Bachelor of Arts, focused on critical thinking, holistic learning, and the humanities. Now, on the surface, it may be a simple thing to say theological education is theoretical in nature. On the one hand, we long for a process in which pre-ministry students are formed and transformed by the education so that learning is passing truth from teacher to student in a way that changes lives and prepares the clergy person to minister in the church. But on the other hand, the very nature of theological education in the West has changed so much since the mid-20th century that we have to admit we have inherited a situation where the answer to this question is compromised. What is the goal of theological education? The answer will vary depending entirely on whether the answer is given by a closed-minded pragmatist. The seminary must teach me X, Y, and Z. How to read a budget in the Excel spreadsheet, how to write charge conference reports, how to hire and fire staff, how to deal with conflict management. Or the ivory tower idealist. The seminary need only teach me the Ordo Salutis, the biblical languages, and explain various theories of the atonement, etc. We must face the reality that, at least in the United States, the change from the Bachelor of Divinity degree to the Master of Divinity degree in 1971 is a complicating issue. The history of theological education is way beyond my task here this afternoon, but I need to trace just a few points in broad outline. The Roman Catholic Church created a new environment for the formation of clergy in the 16th century called the seminary, which means seedbed. The first seminary prototype at Harvard College in 1636 had the goal of producing learned clergy, or what we today might call pastoral theologians. The 3-year curriculum of that degree program was focused on 3 areas of study: Bible, church history, and theology. By around 1800, the degree granted for this curriculum was the Bachelor of Divinity, which was the primary degree required for clergy preparation in most all denominations. As institutions grew, both as embedded schools of theology in universities or as self-standing seminaries, the Bachelor of Divinity was replaced by the Master of Divinity in around the early 1970s. It's now called a professional degree with a wider curriculum than the BD. In addition to the classical or theoretical conceptual disciplines, the MDiv now includes courses in the practice of ministry, required clergy internships in local congregations and hospitals, or mentored ministry. The truth is, the MDiv is nearly impossibly loaded with requirements. And perhaps the dirty little secret, except to those of us actively working in theological education, is that the Association of Theological Schools Hereafter, I'll refer to it as the ATS, the governing body that accredits all Master of Divinity degrees, sets the requirements for the degrees not in numbers of hours earned, but in time devoted to the curriculum. They say an MDiv program shall require a minimum of 3 academic years of full-time work or its equivalent. That means that currently, the degree itself varies wildly between various seminaries and divinity schools, some of which require 72 hours to others requiring up to 92 hours of coursework. After I wrote this, a friend put me on to a research report from the ATS that said that 15% of accredited seminaries in the US and Canada require 91 to 99 hours. Another 15% require over 100 hours for the MDiv. We call it a professional degree, but as a hybrid degree program requiring courses in both classical and applied disciplines, we currently have no consistency across schools for what the MDiv actually does. But there's more. We must acknowledge at this moment of reconstructing Methodism that the problem with the older, broken Methodism was not the MDiv itself, whatever its inadequacies and shortcomings, but rather the lack of consistency in the quality and nature of the MDiv our clergy students were receiving. The president at Asbury who hired me, Dr. Maxie Dunham, was fond of saying, "As the seminary goes, so goes the pastor. As the pastor goes, so goes the church. As the goes, so goes the world." I later found out after I wrote this, a friend told me that actually that's been accredited to Ed Robb Jr., and it was also accredited to Albert Outler. So I have no idea who first said it, but I first heard it from Maxie Dunham. That statement, which admittedly has in it as much overstatement as we might expect from a seminary president, and doesn't give enough responsibility to the laity for safeguarding the vision and mission of the church, that statement still rings in my ears as an important reminder of the importance of theological education. And there's no doubt that an aggressive liberal or progressive agenda became so embedded in many seminaries that some are justified in placing blame there for why Methodism needs reconstruction. One anecdote makes the point. A clergy friend of mine with an MDiv from one of our leading mainline seminaries, which will go unnamed here, once explained to me that in his incoming first year, students were expected to study the various methodologies being taught in the school: liberation theology, deconstructionist theology, feminist theology, post-colonial theology, etc., and to make that methodological focus his main interest throughout the rest of his curriculum. Now, in such a context, I cannot imagine successfully preparing a Methodist pastor theologian for effective ministry. Without going further into this point, I simply offer the notion that a confessional seminary, by which I mean in this context, a school in which all the faculty members are committed to a single confessional stance, is the best way, perhaps the only way, to ensure quality control in the church. We could talk about this perhaps in the panel, but let me come back if I have time to say more about that. Let me move on to my second point, the higher education in the West. This can be summed up a good deal quicker by simply noting that the nature of higher education in the West has changed considerably since the end of World War II. The GI Bill made college education a possibility for thousands of young people who would never have previously considered it in their grasp. I speak of this from personal experience since my own father was a farmer, the son of farmers for as far back as we can count, and who in his late teens and early 20s would have laughed out loud at the very thought of enrolling in college for higher education. Then Hitler invaded Poland, the U.S. went to war, and Dad was drafted into service. While in Europe being shot at by Nazis, my father had it was called into Christian ministry, and there's a whole long story I'd love to share with you there sometime. He returned to his farm in his little Methodist church in Bryantsville, Kentucky, and he told his family he needed to start back to school for clergy education. His journey was a long and twisted story, which included dealing with a very disappointed father, my grandfather. But there's no doubt that he was one of thousands who took advantage of the GI Bill to enroll in seminary, in university. who prior to their experiences in the armed forces would never have imagined such a turn of events. And today, the result is that a college education is thought of as an entitlement. Advanced education is now something that should be available to anyone who wishes to go further in their learning. Indeed, that has almost become a reality. And the level of educational attainment has soared as a result. But educational attainment is only that, the accruing of degrees. The numbers of college-educated professionals in our congregations is higher now than ever before. And as I say, the number of individuals attaining college degrees has never been as high. But one could easily make the case that the actual level of learning has gone down. Paradoxically, the rise of the number of degrees earned is not matched by a rise in learning. So part of the difficulty we face in our discussion about theological education in the old Methodism is the influence of education in the West generally, and its lack of any formational core. To explain what I mean, I find the older assessment of Neil Postman relevant at this point. Whatever we may think about his assessment of our society as a technopoly, there remains a degree of truth in his warning about societies that deify technology, that seek its authorization in technology, find its satisfaction in technology, and takes orders from technology. A technopoly is characterized by a surplus of information generated by technology, using newer tools of technology to provide direction and purpose for the society and for individuals. Postman offers the following as an assessment of the significance of this for higher education, and I know this is dated to 1993, so I'll try to update it in just a few moments. In consideration of the disintegrative power of technopoly, perhaps the most important contribution schools can make to education of our youth is to give them a sense of coherence in their studies, a sense of purpose, meaning, and interconnectedness in what they learn. Modern secular education is failing because it doesn't teach who Ginger Rogers, Norman Mailer, and 1,000 other people are. And perhaps here we would say we're not teaching them who Taylor Swift and LeBron James and 1,000 other people are. But it's failing because it has no moral, social, or intellectual center. Now, he's talking about higher ed generally in the West. It has no moral, social, or intellectual center. There is no set of ideas or attitudes that permeates all parts. Oops, there we go. Now we're ready. All parts of the curriculum. The curriculum is not, in fact, a course of study at all, but a meaningless hodgepodge of subjects. It does not even put forward a clear vision of what it constitutes an educated person, unless it is a person who possesses skills. In other words, a technocrat's ideal, a person with no commitment and no point of view, but with plenty of marketable skills. The educational climate of our times is no longer formational at all. By merely informational and preparatory, it becomes preparing for a degree of gainful employment. I fear we are now in a setting where theological education is viewed by many as wholly and simplistically a matter of hoops jumping rather than soul transforming and mind transforming for ministry in the church. And so we often hear the old joke, are you in seminary or cemetery? And perhaps rightly so. On the one hand, requiring less education in clergy will send them into congregations with higher levels of educational attainment than the pastors themselves. More importantly, the GMC must rethink the need for quality control to ensure that whatever the requirements, the current 60 hours for elders or higher, the real need is to ensure a, in Postman's words, moral, social, and intellectual center for the theological education, or a commitment to ideas that permeate all parts of the curriculum. I propose here the only way to achieve this quality control of education is in a confessional setting. Now let me move thirdly to, or letter C of the first point here, to the proposed educational requirements for the Global Methodist Church. The GMC's Transitional Book of Doctrines and Discipline requires no specific degree program for ordination as deacon or elder. It does require 10 courses or 30 credit units for those pursuing deacon's orders, 5 to be taken prior to ordination that may be considered the core, covering Old and New Testaments, introductions, leadership, Methodist theology, and GMC history and polity. 5 additional courses are required within 7 years after ordination, a process that essentially establishes 2 tracks. The first is for deacons who plan to continue on to ordination as an elder, who thus have to take a class in homiletics, and another track with 4 additional electives from a wide array of options, including counseling, worship, apologetics, evangelism, and missions, and others. There's also in the elders track, deacons continuing on to be ordained elders must then take an additional 10 courses, including 6 courses in church history, congregational finance and administration, theology, and electives in Old and New Testament. Within 7 years after ordination, the remaining 4 courses will be taken as electives from among an array of options. The requirements for ordination as an elder constitute a stripped-down MDiv, reduced to 60 units, rather than the minimum 72 units required by the ATS. One peculiarity of the MDiv program is a variation of requirements among institutions already approved by the GM. For example, United Theological Seminary requires a 72-unit MDiv. Wesley Biblical Seminary requires a 79-unit MDiv. Asbury Theological Seminary requires a 96-hour MDiv. On the one hand, I applaud the GMC for the creative and helpful way they have set out tracks for deacons and elders, and clearly and cleverly proposed how one could piece together courses from different institutions here and there to accomplish the goal. In theory, one could be ordained an elder without earning a master's level degree and could take courses from 3, 4, or more separate institutions, cobbling the courses together regardless of institutional degree requirements, as long as their annual conference's Board of Ministry approved the courses. On the other hand, this could be imagined as a type of education by committee, in which no single philosophy of education streams through the curriculum holding it together. This is, of course, complicated further by a variety of delivery systems. Some of these courses are entirely online, some are hybrids, some are entirely face-to-face and in-person courses. Another bias that I admit regarding theological education, and I'm very nervous to bring this up here, and I'm sure I will be one of the few in the room who believes this way, and that is that the biblical languages are not mentioned at all in these GMC requirements. Sorry, I teach Hebrew. This is what I do for a living. I'm committed to it. This is where I stand. It strikes me as somewhat unusual that a new denomination with such a focus on biblically sound teaching and training has neglected any requirements at all, either in a minimal amount of New Testament Greek or some introductory facility with both Greek and Hebrew. This point, while most will assume it should be a sidebar conversation, although I'm putting it right out here on the table, it's certainly not what our ancestors, especially Wesley and Asbury themselves, would have wished. I have too much to say to you in the time I've got, but what I've cut out are quotes after quotes after quotes from Wesley and Asbury, one of them of Asbury especially, riding along through the Cumberland Gap on his horse studying Hebrew vowel pointing, or finding in one of his travels spending the night overnight with a Jewish host and taking the opportunity to stay up reading Hebrew with him all night just because he had such a good scholar that he could work through his Hebrew with him. And that's Asbury. That's not Wesley. We all know Wesley's abilities with the languages. Turning from what many will assume is a distracting sidebar, that is my angst over biblical languages, I raise a more substantial observation here. As it stands, without a requirement for degree completion, I have concerns about the ability of such theological education, potentially cobbled together from multiple schools with no real degree learning objectives driving the curriculum, to produce a genuinely formational education. While that's soaking in, let me move on to my reflections. So I have till 3:45. Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm going to have to skip over some of this. My biblical reflections, I'll start with summarizing something here about the personal self and the private self. It is commonly assumed today that every human individual possesses both a public self. The private or inner self is the one that is true, spontaneous, and authentic, whereas the public or social self is a mask that hides the real person. This is something that is very common in the culture in which we are moving. The public sphere is thought to put restraints on individual freedoms, shackling the private self because society imposes limitations on one's freedoms, whereas the private sphere alone allows for full expression of the individual. One's public self is the actor that hides the inner authentic self. It is not uncommon today to hear someone express the idea that the roles we play in public are foreign and artificial to us because we are following a script written by someone else, whereas we are only true to ourselves when we are alone or with those closest to us. By contrast, the pre-Hellenistic ancient world of the Old Testament did not share this conviction that the private self was the real self, or even that there was an essential dichotomy between private and public. And here is a quote from Carol van der Toorn: "The modern cult of authenticity was foreign to the ancient frame of mind." Now, this is a very important point, and it was going to be my introduction to a whole series of other discussions, which I'm going to rush on to now. I was going to talk to you about the whole role of education in the book of Deuteronomy and the way that the education in Deuteronomy is so deeply formational. And the reason I'm doing this, although I'm going to skip some of the details, is because I believe this is at the very foundation of what you and I should be thinking about in theological education, and that is that it's formational rather than simply informational. So this is the famous passage immediately after the Shema, when the child says to you, this is the catechumen's question. A child says to you, "What are the stipulations, the rituals, and the judgments that Yahweh our God has commanded you?" Then you must say to your child, "We were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, but Yahweh brought us out from Egypt with a strong hand. Yahweh displayed great and grievous signs and wonders against Egypt." So I'm not going to read the whole passage just for the sake of time. But what I want to say is how amazingly subtle this is. Because the child understands, the child knows that he is already a part of a community when he says, "What are the stipulations, the rituals, and the judgments that Yahweh, our God, has commanded us?" He knows that he is in the people of the Lord, the people of Yahweh, and he wants to know, what are these laws that we've been given? Now, Deuteronomy loves lists, and it's always listing the kinds of laws you should be keeping. And the most famous, of course, are the 10 big ones, the 10 Commandments. We would have expected that the answer to this question, the child's question, what are these laws? Now, the part I'm skipping is when I would tell you more about this. They talked about these laws while they were rising, while they were lying down, when they were going out, when they were coming in, they were having dinner. They're supposed to be talking about the law all the time. And Deuteronomy is assuming that you, the parent, know the laws well enough to repeat them frequently to the child. And the child sees them written on the doorpost of their home and hears the parents constantly talk about them. And finally, the child grows up old enough to say, "What are these stipulations?" And we would have expected the book of Deuteronomy to give you another list. These are the laws that we were given. But what you get is, we were Pharaoh's slaves. And the child learns at the earliest stage, you have to know who you are before you can understand what these laws mean and before you can apply them to your life. So the answer begins with the formation. The answer is the education. But the answer is shaping and forming the child and making the child a part of the body of the Lord, the people of the Lord. Now, I was going to rush on and say, this essentially is what the ecclesia is. I'm not an expert on New Testament, but I do believe that mathetes, the word disciple, is one who's learning from the rabbi. And that meant 3 years of following along beside the rabbi and learning from the rabbi in a formational process. And I believe that's based on Deuteronomy. So I'm going to quickly hasten on to say, let's talk about then the early church. In the early church, I'm going to give one example. Not only is this the biblical data, so I'm suggesting that what we mean by formational education, learning that changes who you are so that you'll be a better pastor, that starts in Deuteronomy. It goes all through the Old Testament. It's confirmed in the discipleship of the New Testament, and it's also illustrated in the early church. I offer here only one simple example to show what I mean. The need to summarize the gospel is stated beautifully by Cyril, Bishop of Jerusalem. In his catechetical lectures, Cyril articulated the need to re-educate the masses of the Roman Empire. In that period, church buildings first began to be covered with visual representation of the biblical narrative in mural and mosaic. Most people couldn't read, and so they learned about the Bible story through art and through icons. While most had neither ability or leisure to read biblical codices, the existence of the newly formulated Nicene Creed, which had just been written, was useful summary for the catechumens. And so you have the same question-answer format in education. And so Cyril, the bishop, said about the Nicene Creed, "In learning the faith and in professing it, acquire and keep that only which is delivered to you by the church, and which has been powerfully composed out of all the Scriptures. For since all cannot read the Scriptures, some being hindered as to the knowledge of them by want of learning, and others by want of leisure, in order that the soul may not perish from ignorance, we comprise the whole doctrine of the faith in a few lines. This summary I wish you both to commit to memory when I recite it, and to rehearse with all your diligence among yourselves, not writing it out on paper, but engraving it by memory upon your heart. For the articles of the faith were not composed on the basis of human preferences. Rather, the most important points were collected out of all the Scripture to make up one complete teaching of the faith. And just as the mustard seed in one small grain contains many branches, so also this faith has embraced it in few words, all the knowledge of godliness in the Old and New Testaments." My point in this little digression is that Christians from the earliest times recognized the centrality of this same Deuteronomic need to learn and love God with our minds as learning the faith, and they used every means available to them in making that happen. It was in his day that they learned to make books for the first time, a codices, so that what you have is the church using the technology available to get the word in the hearts and minds of the people. Our Wesleyan heritage has been perhaps the most dramatic illustration of this central core of Christianity. And so very quickly, I want to move to education in the Wesleyan tradition. I need not document here the focus in early Methodism on the priority of education. Instead, I want to take this moment to reflect, however inadequately, on Wesley's ideal for training the ordained ministry. While Wesley himself stand as the whole arbiter for the way we do theological education today, he nevertheless has theological practical wisdom to offer. The best way to position ourselves in his legacy is not by attempting to replicate the 18th century experience, but by, quote, allowing our engagement with our own setting to be informed by insights that animated Wesley's leadership of the original people called Methodists, a quote from Heisenreiter. The first section of his treatise, an address to clergy, outlines his principles and ideas on the nature of ordained ministry. So Wesley first begins by saying there's such a thing as natural endowments that were given by nature. So the person who's given natural endowments by nature is someone who has a good understanding, clear apprehension, sound judgment, a capacity for reasoning, but also a capacity for liveliness and readiness, which is necessary to answer a fool according to his folly, in Wesley's words, quoting the Psalms. And finally, Wesley noted a good memory is a requisite for the ideal minister. But then he moves on from these natural endowments to what Wesley calls the acquired endowments. And this is knowledge that can be gained through theological education. The first, he says, is a knowledge of vocation, addressing the need to be certain of one's calling to ministry. Second, a knowledge of the whole of Scripture. Everyone so prepared for ministry must be a good textuary in his word, well informed in the Bible and biblical scholarship. Wesley advocates here the study of every word, verse, and chapter in order to build a spiritual meaning. Related to this point, third, the knowledge of the Scripture in the original languages. Without such knowledge, Wesley believes, the minister will not be able to give an answer of the defense of the faith when called upon. Fourth, the knowledge of secular history, ancient socio-political events, chronology, geography. This one surprises us a bit, but Wesley's making here a case for a broad education in what today we call the liberal arts, so that the minister will be well-rounded in every respect. Fifth, the knowledge of science. And here Wesley includes a familiarity with natural philosophy, geometry, but especially the philosophical subdiscipline of logic, which he defines as the art of good sense, of apprehending things clearly, judging truly, and reasoning conclusively. Sixth, church history, especially the early fathers, who are, quote, the most authentic commentators on Scripture as being nearest the fountain and eminently endued with that Spirit by whom all Scripture is given. And then seventh, knowledge of the world, by which he refers to knowledge of people, their maxims, tempers, and manners, such as they occur in real life. This is undoubtedly what we today call psychology and its related fields of especially pastoral counseling. Wesley supplements these 7 with common sense and good breeding, by which he appears to be referring to a propriety of behavior so that the ideal minister combines, quote, all the courtesy of a gentleman joined with the correctness of a scholar. He concludes his discussion of acquired endowments with, and this is kind of funny, an insistence on a strong, clear, musical voice and a good delivery, both with regard to pronunciation and action, which would entail what we today call homiletics. Wesley makes allowances for many clergy for whom opportunities for this acquired knowledge, what we would call theological education, he admits that it's not possible for all. Yet he also holds, quote, it's inexcusable before God and man, those who had opportunity for education but failed to use it. Now let me conclude. I have successfully cut enough things out that I can say I've made it to my conclusion. As Christians, we believe the things that are dead can come back to life. That's the point of the story, after all. In all its iterations, deliverance from the death of slavery in Egypt, return and restoration after the exile in Babylonia, and of course, Christ's final victory over death. As G.K. Chesterton has it, Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave. That passage comes from a context where he's talking about what he was referring to as ancient Asian religion. We would today call it ancient Near Eastern history. And he was saying, it seems to have such of an age that it will never die. It's too old to die, he said. And then he said, but Christianity has died and risen many times. In the same way, Methodism can be said to have experienced times of death and resurrection. This, I believe, is a moment of resurrection. And this new expression of Methodism, the GMC, must do all it can to buttress the revival of our tradition that we are witnessing in our day. I've been moved all day today, and especially, Madeline, as you were speaking, I believe that we are witnessing a revival across this continent, and I believe God can afford to bless Wesleyan Arminian theology. Now, I want to be careful to say that because I don't want to say it in a way that comes off as prideful. But the Reformed Calvinist folks have had it all their own way for 100 years. And if we could go through and show how many of those institutions in my world, in the educational world, are struggling and selling off property and diminishing and having struggles. And I don't celebrate that. But I do believe what we're witnessing is a genuine movement of God. And the GMC will only be successful in as much as it can come along and add fat to the fire, as my parents would say, and keep that flame going and not get in the way of what is happening in that revival. And so I believe this is a moment of resurrection of our tradition. And these are exciting days. To be sure, and to be true to our Methodist heritage, I believe we must retrieve a vision of formational training for our clergy. I believe it is incumbent upon every clergy person to acquire as much formal education as their giftedness and life circumstances will allow. Such a charge is true to the spirit of Wesley's address to the clergy, and I affirm it as a recommendation for the GMC. I do not find fault with the general plans contained in the current GMC Traditional Book of Doctrines and Discipline. Indeed, I think there's a lot of creative thinking there, and I give them credit for that book of discipline. I think a lot of good things are said there. However, I believe the approved final book of Doctrines and Discipline should state that we expect, again, in the spirit of John Wesley in his address to the clergy, we expect our clergy candidates to get as much theological training as possible, and that in the U.S. and in Europe, the MDiv is desired and expected of all candidates applying for ordination as an elder. The ATS is standard, again, that's Asbury, that's the Association of Theological Schools. Their stated purpose for the MDiv degree is on the screen: to prepare persons for ordained ministry and for general pastoral and religious leadership responsibilities in congregations and other settings. I cannot imagine a new Wesleyan denomination in our day requiring less of its clergy than this. Exceptions could be made by annual conferences and bishops as deemed appropriate for the local context. But simply stated, the community-based, partly in-person learning outcomes required in an MDiv degree, which spread throughout the curriculum, should be the level of expectation for elders. In theory, others with giftedness and opportunity should go further to earn a doctorate, right? In theology or in one of the other classical disciplines, preparing them to become pastoral theologians in the Wesleyan image. So if we're saying go as far as one can go, then the MDiv is the minimum, but please go further if you have life circumstances and skills. As a minimum, I conclude here by proposing that the GMC should use a course of study curriculum to train and prepare permanent deacons, whereas the MDiv or equivalent should continue to serve as a minimum benchmark for elders. The current 60-hour format is not far from that norm. It's not far from that norm, but should be changed for the U.S.-European context for the foreseeable future. And before you stand up, I started 2 minutes late, so I want to come back to what I was saying earlier. I passed up a little footnote earlier where I was talking about a seamless theological education theory that runs throughout the curriculum. Now, this doesn't sound idealistic for a moment, but I think this is the only way to talk about quality control. If one goes to a seminary where a third of the faculty members are Roman Catholic and a third are Episcopalian and a third are any branch of Protestantism, there's not going to be what I would call a confessional focus, such as a commitment to Wesleyan Arminian theology. Similarly, questions on infant baptism that Dr. Vickers brought up. You can go to some seminaries where there's no seamless Wesleyan Arminian image being spread throughout the curriculum, and you have questions on women in ministry, infant baptism, all number of things that are very dear to us as Wesleyans, but they're, when a person goes to pastoral counseling class, are they getting something different from the class in New Testament theology or in systematic theology? I do think that has to be put on the table as well. It's something that we do have to think about. So, thank you for your time. I will just conclude by repeating what I said for a moment ago for us to think about further. I do believe that it is incumbent upon, come back to page 3, sorry. The conclusion was that we ask as a minimum, that the MDiv for the elders be there and that we encourage them to go further if they're able. Okay, thank you.